Unmuted.
It'll be great. We'll start the conversation about accountability in the planning department today. So thank you, everybody. We'll now convene this work session. It's a work session on AO 2024-83S. Today is the 4th of October. We are scheduled from 11:50 to 12:50. It's 11:55 now. We'll start with the roll. Mr. Martinez.
George Martinez.
Randy Salt.
Mark Littlefield.
Scott Myers.
Karen Bronga.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant. Meg Zalatel is here. All right, so Ms. Zalatel, this is your work session. The work session is on ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code Title 21 to update the plan unit development of approval process and waiving planning and zoning commission review of certain provisions. Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a short presentation that walks us through the ordinance. I'm actually going to cover a few things before we dive into the presentation, and I'll cover them again during the presentation. This ordinance was introduced on August 27th, 2024, and set for public hearing on October 8th, 2024 at that August introduction. An S version was introduced on September 24th, 2024, and now we have our work session. So this has been pending since the end of August. So if we go to the next slide, an introduction to the PUD, or Planned Unit Development. It's a substantive set of requirements that allow flexibility within zoning to achieve the creation of it says more desirable environment, but a more desirable plan that would be possible through a strict application of the zoning ordinance. If you remember, we talked a lot about planned unit development in the context of the Holton Hills development. A planned unit development is approved through a conditional use process, and that process is spelled out in code, and there's the citation. Conditional use is an entitlement process that requires a public hearing at the Planning and Zoning Commission, and developers are required to provide a significant amount of information to planning and zoning and go through a pretty prescriptive process for conditional use to get an approved planned unit development. And the public is provided a chance to comment on the planned unit development and interact with the developer throughout that process. So if we go to the next slide, this ordinance does a couple of things. First, it eliminates redundancies in the application by removing extra, unnecessary, and costly layers of entitlement process by eliminating the need for a wide variety of separate variances that also have to be applied for. So the idea of a planned unit development is to be flexible, to look at a plan holistically and say, does this development make sense for how it's proposed, where it's located, and what's trying to be achieved? Right now, if you submit a planned unit development, currently every deviation from a Title 21 standard requires an accompanying variance that has separate standards that differ from the criteria of a planned unit development, although it's usually heard concurrently by planning and zoning or as part of the same case. This ordinance also removes the special limitation on the underlying zoning designation as an option. Excuse me, instead relying on the conditional use process to establish any regulatory limits. So if we think about this, the thing you want to do as a developer is create a planned unit development, and then the conditional use process is how you achieve that. Right now, as the current law stands, you would not only have to go through the conditional use process, but also obtain a variance as another regulatory step, and possibly also have a special limitation placed on the parcels themselves. All of those things, what's currently approved through a variance and a special limitation, could all be handled within the single regulatory mechanism of a conditional use. So takes from 3 potential regulatory paths down to 1. And the ordinance also allows for planned unit development on 1 acre lot. So if we go to the next slide, these are much more detailed outcomes that can happen under this ordinance, allowing a higher housing unit density than what is currently allowed in a zoning district. We did that in approving the disposal and development agreement for Holton Hills. It allows a developer to use smaller lot sizes than are currently allowed in a zoning district. It also allows flexibility within the zoning district. So you could do some mixed use development neighborhoods. It allows developer to propose building setbacks and height differences from those currently allowed in the zoning district, really because it makes sense as part of the planned unit development and how the project could pencil for the developer. It allows the developer to propose minor adjustments to other design standards in Title 21, which could result in a better use of property, reducing the cost of construction. Remember, one of the biggest costs of construction, one of the biggest cost drivers is roads, curb, gutter, sewer. So if you can lay out a property in a way that minimizes those costs, and it reduces the open space requirements to 15%, which is consistent with other zoning districts. So it does achieve a lot of flexibility for basically a developer to look at their parcels, look at what they're trying to achieve, their bottom line, and saying, okay, what can I do here? What's the plan? And present a full plan to the community that then goes through a public process. Next slide, please. What this ordinance does not do, it does not limit or change the public process for establishing a planned unit development. It does not change the requirement for the planning, zoning, commission approval through the conditional use process, and it does not guarantee that a planned unit development will be approved. So the conditional use process that currently exists remains intact. Go to the next slide. So I did a little bit of analysis on the potential impacts of the ordinance. Additional 1 acre lots that become open for multifamily development, including small site infill, a mobile home park redevelopment, and Anchorage Bowl are there on that map in purple. Total throughout the MOA, there are 1,790 lots that are over 1 acre zone residential, vacant, or mobile home parks in the MOA. So that's a redevelopment potential or development potential contained in this ordinance. And if we go to the next slide, we also have the breakdown there of potential development potential in Girdwood and Eagle River Chugiak using that same analysis of 1 acre lots that are zoned residential and are vacant or currently mobile home parks. So as you can see, based on the number of purple squares, there's a lot of potential for a planned unit development. It is something that developers are favoring because it really allows them to create an all-in cost to their development, to put various elements together. We exercise the flexibility in a planned unit development when we disposed of the lots in Holton Hills. The underlying zoning district of those parcels would not have allowed the larger multifamily, but we indicated in our disposal that the planned unit development would have to include 2 lots for multifamily of not less than 8 units each. And that can only be achieved through a planned unit development. So if we go to the next slide, back to the process. Again, this was introduced at the end of August. The S version introduced 2 changes. It explicitly waived the Planning and Zoning Commission review. The rationale for that is twofold, and I worked with Mr. Hurt on this. One is there's nothing in the code that prevents Planning and Zoning Commission from weighing in via resolution. They can issue advisory opinions without a case. The code allows them to be an act like every other board and commission. So they certainly could have weighed in during this time if they had concerns. Second, changes to the open space requirement. The S version eliminates the open space requirement. And I will tell you, I'm on the fence about this a little bit. One of the reasons I put that in the S version is there's this concern that if a planned unit development comes forward and has small fee simple lots where residents would maybe want to put up fences for their yards, that would not be considered as meeting the open space requirement, and either fences would be prohibited as some kind of condition or restriction. So I think there might be an amendment that could work instead that would be much more targeted to that concern, that say fences don't interrupt the open space requirement if they're otherwise allowed by code. So we're having the work session today. Public hearing is scheduled for Tuesday night. And then if we go through the last slide, in summary, reducing the entitlement timeline cost of the PUD process, planned unit development process, I think is good for Anchorage. We've worked to encourage housing development. This streamlines a tool. I think that is really good tool to use. I think the planned unit development has the opportunity to really be the tool for any kind of subdivision or development that is not by right, so that we can start to standardize the tool we're using that still allows for flexibility and public input. And I believe that changes to this meet the goals of 1 through 5 of the Assembly's Housing Action Plan. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Anna.
Yeah, I guess, so I have some other questions, but I'll start with, so what you said is basically the current process is that there is this planned unit development piece of code that lets people, gives more flexibility, and it is intended to allow for different types of designs than what would be there by default. And also, in addition to that process, which is a conditional use process, we also make people get a bunch of variances. Is that correct?
Yes, those variances can run current in the planning and zoning case, and the staff report will analyze any potential variances in those staff reports according to the separate and distinct variance standards.
Okay, thanks. So basically, it's a process that allows essentially a giant variance from code and then says you have to get these other variances.
Correct.
Okay, thanks. So I guess maybe I'm telegraphing that I think this is a good idea to not also make people get variances. So thanks for clarifying that.
I'll just add that variance is still reviewed, so.
Right, it's administrative review though, instead of going through the whole expensive, time-consuming process. Ms. Braga.
So if you are going to take out that they have to get all of these separate variances, could that be accomplished without waiving Planning and Zoning Commission review? Could those zone exemptions be in some way packaged so that we can make it less onerous but not take out that step? And then a second thing, I'm just someone who, I don't really understand plan use development, but let's say you have 2.5 acres and you want to build 25 tiny little homes and it's R2A. Is that this is allowing that development even though it's not the right code or the right type of zoning district for that development?
I'm going to answer those in reverse. There's a chart in the ordinance that shows what the maximum unit density is per zoning district. So I don't believe what you are suggesting would be possible. I don't have the ordinance in front of me. I didn't get a copy of it. Perfect. Thank you, Graham. R2A would allow 14. And you would have to lay out your plan and then go through a public process where the community could comment on it and have Planning and Zoning Commission decide if that would be the right fit, right, for what you're proposing. There are standards. Planned unit development are substantive standards. So you have to still meet those standards, even though you may not meet the strict standards of Title 21 otherwise. And then on the variance piece, there is no separate. So for a planned unit development, Planning and Zoning Commission is not waived. You go through the Planning and Zoning Commission. The waiver of Planning and Zoning Commission is for this ordinance to go before us, because I think we should be able to take control and make decisions around which regulatory tools we want available in our community.
Thanks for clarifying that.
All right, Ms. Brawley.
And thank you. And maybe we were going to get to this anyway, but I think my questions are for the administration, because I see we have Graham and Nolan here. And just I'm reading through this planning memo that I think we all just got. And I guess basically what I'm seeing is not so much these will cause problems, but we need more time and discussion of if there are problems, and then be some raising of what's in code and saying we don't know the implications of changing the code, but I don't see a strong rationale for what is already in code. And I'm going to point to, just for example, where did I see it? Like at the top of page 2, it talks about we haven't been able to evaluate the benefit or impact of the change from the 2-acre minimum to 1-acre minimum, or the original reasoning behind the 2-acre minimum. So I guess what I'm seeing is not a strong rationale for not doing this. So maybe you guys could speak to your guys' position and if you have anything from planning. Thanks.
Yeah, I think happy to speak more generally to this memo. On that point in particular, I think Member Brawley, your reading is absolutely correct. When I talked with planning this morning, they said we have a 2-acre minimum requirement, and we weren't part of what led to that requirement being established. We don't in the planning code have sort of the legislative intent in the planning code. So what they raised is maybe there was a reason at the time for the 2-acre minimum, but they didn't have a sense of what that was. And they did not have a professional opinion that a 2-acre minimum was currently necessary. So in the planning department memo, we tried to make that reasoning clear for you all as you're making a decision about this ordinance. We don't have a clear reason. And in fact, there may be many benefits to reducing to 1 acre. So I think that's for you all to weigh as you make your decision.
Just maybe more generally, if you could share if there is a position from the administration on this, or what your evaluation of this is.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would say we endorse this. This is a good idea. Agree with Member Zolotel's statements about the value of this change and the need for this change. And I think these are good and positive changes, especially about the duplicative. I think I can speak maybe a little bit to sort of planning's position, which I think is slightly different than perhaps my position or our sort of official position. I think planning is here raising all the potential concerns for you all to consider. When I look through this, I see two possible paths for you all forward. One is you could pass it as is and the sky will not fall, right? This process is a voluntary process that people enter into in order to get flexibility. If we create additional flexibility, we could see maybe a slightly undesirable development happen through this process. Maybe that's sort of the worst case scenario risk here if you passed this on Tuesday as is. Maybe some of the numbers could be tweaked. Maybe we need a slightly different number of lots allowed in R1A. The staff has not had the time to evaluate those numbers or understand the rationale for those numbers. If we went through the Planning and Zoning Commission process, they would have a chance to do a full staff report to really dig into these details, do public outreach to get input from the public about these ideas in a more formal way. And so staff would love the opportunity to go through that planning and zoning process in order to do that review. I think the disadvantage of that second option is that that's going to take 3 or 4 months. So then we're looking at this coming back to you in February, which means I think my sense of the timelines, this would not be then usable in the 2025 building season, which I understand to be the sponsor's intention.
Is that good? All right. Ms. Ellis.
Thanks. If Planning and Zoning Commission wants to review this, I'm not open to a 3 or 4 month process. But I would give them one opportunity. I mean, they would meet twice a month. They've had the chance to take this up, but we could give them a chance to take it up at their next meeting and issue a resolution if that's in fact the case. I want to put some stuff on the record because I think it's really important. This was introduced deliberately at the end of August with a 6-week runway. So there would be time for the Planning and Zoning Commission to weigh in if it wanted to, knowing that they meet twice a month. Additionally, I met with Mr. Downing shortly after this was introduced and said, hey, if the planning department has any feedback on this, I would really like it. And I heard nothing until I received this memo today. So I'm a little bit still feeling stuck between a rock and a hard place on how to engage with the planning department on these things when I created deliberately a longer runway to get the feedback and open into a collaborative process. And so I don't know what to do about that. So I just wanted to share that with members because I did create a longer runway. I think it's a great compromise. I don't think it's effective for members to be applicants for cases in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission. I don't think it's a process suited to us because I've tried that and it doesn't work. So, and I know Mr. Co-sponsor wants to weigh in too.
Yeah, instead of the queue, I just want to respond. So Graham, is it possible that we could just pass this and Planning and Zoning can do the review and then come back later with any changes? We can always make changes later down the road.
Always change it.
Right. You could do a cleanup ordinance in a couple months after you pass it on Tuesday. That's right.
Ms. Fun.
I just wondered, is this in any way related to a certain project that someone is trying to help with? Or, I mean, I just wonder if there's some backstory that why this is coming forward.
So I did quite a bit of stakeholder engagement. I talked to Cook Inlet Housing. I talked to Andre Spinelli about some challenges he's had with trying to use planned unit development. I'm aware of the Carroll Creek planned unit development and some of the challenges there. And then the upcoming one to go through will be Holden Hills. So it's in response to hearing the ongoing issues and complaints. Part of bringing the home initiative is we got all of the issues, regardless if they had anything to do with what we were proposing. And some of it was how the strict application of the current zoning code gets in the way. But that we had this process, but nobody was really using it because it's redundant and difficult.
So I was going to talk about Cook Inlet Housing. I believe that I was told that they could not have done Grass Creek Village as code is now, and that this is important to those kinds of developments. And I hope I have that right. And then the other thing I was thinking of is someone at University Community Council did bounce the idea that there's so many changes happening. He's in development and said, nobody wants to develop right now because they're waiting to see when we finally stop changing things. And I get a little nervous when I hear that. I don't know how truthful that is, but I think there is a lot going on. So.
Others? Okay, so I'm gonna, if we're done with the main matter of the topic, gonna provide a little update on a project that I'm working on right now. Are you done? You can, do
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess,
you have more?
does it have to do with this, your update?
Title 21 in the planning department, yes.
Okay.
So I have recently referred to the ombudsman a kind of set of documents that I have received after review from my team that demonstrates that the planning department, after a neighborhood specific plan was adopted by the assembly, made edits and amendments that changed the context and content of the plan that was adopted, which I think is a violation of the law, which is practically the planning department inserting their opinions and beliefs and values as the final arbiter of policymaking for the municipality. And I think that this conversation goes toward leadership of the department and what it's been doing and how it's been conducting itself. And the last minute work just kind of triggers the sense among the body. There's been a long and ongoing conversation between the two sides of this conversation. The planning department's mad because the assembly's not listening. Well, the assembly's mad because the planning department's not listening. And now I have evidence that demonstrates the planning department is changing neighborhood plans after the assembly has made final action, which means the assembly is not the final actor. That's the reality of what we're facing in the relationship right now between the planning department and the assembly. Now, I've been in close conversation with the mayor about this because I've been waiting to get the facts right. And I'm close enough to having the facts right that I know there is a there there. And this strained relationship is broken if in fact the planning staff is now appointing themselves the assembly. So you'll be seeing the facts very soon. The ombudsman is compiling the report. He will be calling on various members of the planning staff to understand how and why the changes were made before we come back with a full report. But the assembly needs to know that you at this moment with Title 21 matters are not the final decider. The planning department staff has taken it upon themselves to be that. And so this will not stand. This will not stand. So we will get things back in the proper order of how they're supposed to be. I look forward to a partnership with the mayor to do this. Yep, I get it. I look forward to the partnership with the mayor to do this because I think any rational person would recognize that when a final action is taken at the assembly, it's supposed to be a final action. Ms. Zalato.
Thanks. I guess I appreciate that. That kind of underscores and is a strange culmination of the issues we've been having. We were at a rules committee and the mayor said to make sure we were reaching out to you all to work with the planning department. So I don't know how we work through a 6-week plus lead up to a memorandum at the last minute. This leaves me to work all weekend if I so choose to possibly take into consideration these things or to possibly move to delay ordinance I've worked really hard on and done a lot of stakeholder engagement on. This is important for stakeholder engagement as well. I appreciated meeting with you. You are now have the, I guess, distinguished responsibility of being this go-between. We've got to fix this because this will not be the last Title 21 change likely to come. We have a full housing action plan we intend to implement, and this was fully in line with the with that. And I think we've got to find a better way forward because these matters are such that we're often the front lines for complaints about what isn't working in our city. And so we are empowered to do something about that. And the best way to do that is to bring forward our ideas and then collaborate, and to give time and space for collaboration. But time and space for collaboration can't always be 3 and 4 months. I think 6 weeks is a very ample time, because most ordinances are introduced on a Tuesday night and 2 weeks later they're heard and voted on. So this is 4 times that amount of, or sorry, 3 times that amount of time. My math is always terrible. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think broadly in agreement, we share, Member Constant or Chair Constant, that's very concerning. I think you are the legislative body. Title 21 is legislation. This is your clear authority, and the planning department should not be usurping that authority. Absolutely not. So we will take that very seriously, I am sure. And I think, yeah, Co-Chair Zolotel, I think to your points, I completely agree. We need to reset this relationship. We need to change this relationship. The planning department and this administration want to be an active collaborator with the assembly in figuring out how we solve our housing crisis. And that's going to mean changes to Title 21. And we are eager to figure out how to collaborate more effectively. I think in this case, there was a miscommunication. I think there was a misunderstanding, or sort of the common practice has been that when Title 21 gets changed, it goes through the Planning and Zoning Commission process, right? And that's sort of what we've been used to the last several years. In the past, I understand that planning and zoning has been a little more proactive in sort of tracking assembly legislation and commenting on it with the, I think, the procedure you're suggesting, Member Zolotel. That has not been the current or sort of the recent process. And so I think we got caught a little flat-footed there in terms of getting this in front of planning and zoning and getting sort of an official response sooner than later. I agree, not everything needs to take 4 months to get done. I think this is, for me, also an indicator that the Planning and Zoning Commission process, we need to take a hard look at and make sure that it's a useful process for you. They're an advisory body to you as the assembly. So we need to make sure that that is a useful process where we're incorporating meaningful community feedback, where we're getting staff expertise to look at these changes in a timely and efficient manner that makes better legislation, that makes better code. So we're eager to work towards that. I think we did have an example this week with members Solt and Martinez, a really positive look at how we might sort of shape this collaboration. But yeah, excited to figure out and how to solve that problem together.
You know, we had the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, Graham. We had the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission at our Rules Committee, and he made an interesting admission that effectively they aren't like they used to be, that they are essentially just taking the inputs from the planning staff and reviewing their reports, but not really diving into any of it, not making big proposals of changes. So in some ways, just like the Title 21 process I mentioned, the Planning and Zoning Board at this time is really a body to affirm what the planning staff wants communicated. And so I think that's a pretty substantial challenge that we're facing. And so in the context of fixing that relationship and looking at the Planning and Zoning Commission and making sure that it functions in a manner that's meaningful, the idea should be that it is not just simply to be the pipe for the planning staff to get their decisions that they want on the table. So Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly, I feel obligated to comment as a planner. I think, yeah, I think some of the things that have been described today were the lived experience of folks who have worked on the home initiative and other items. And so it is really unfortunate. I think it is important to understand that planning is in some sense, like Title 21 or zoning code is in some sense like every other chapter of our code, legally, procedurally, all of those things. And also planning deals with property rights, and it deals with also state statute mandated processes, some of which I think we're sort of exempt from as a home rule body, but that deal with our plans. And I think, so I guess I want to bring it back to, I think the two biggest challenges in our community around planning are that we have forgotten what we use plans for. And I think some of that, arguably, you know, you could lay it at the feet of staff, but I think also the whole community, we treat plans as sacrosanct and also like to ignore them. And I think that, and I'm not saying that one person, one administration, that's been the true for probably 40 years, right? And so that's one of our challenges, that we have a dysfunctional relationship to our plans. We spend so much time making small area plans and neighborhood plans because we create these little kind of bespoke areas, how we want each individual area to go. And we haven't updated our comp plan in 25 years, right? Other than the land use plan, which really is almost so complicated, it's unworkable. And I think that's part of why it's hard to implement. So anyway, I know I'm getting far afield of this work session, but I do want to say also, and we alluded to this already, in Title 21, result of our rewrite, I think there are things that are not working. Some of them are content, but also the idea that every single zoning change has to go to planning and zoning. And they have said, as Mr. Constance said, they are structurally not set up to do that, and they have not taken on that role. I think they're interested in it. So I think that's another kind of area that we need to think about. What is the process? And then the other piece of the process is, how do we meaningfully, productively, and in good faith engage with the public when we have a segment of the public who consistently says our plans should not be changed, everything that we decided 20 years ago is still valid, and we should not move forward, right? So I think that, so I just want to put those on the table, because we're talking about a very specific ordinance, but it's in all of the morass that we're dealing with. But I do want to bring it back to the ordinance. I have a question, because I know we've heard some concerns about this idea of removing the open space requirements, or how we define that. And I want to say, I think the assumption behind that is that we have to micromanage what people develop, and that if they don't meet these very specific standards, that it's a bad development. And I think that's a reflection of what happened 40 years ago or more in this city, way before we even had a zoning code that we have now. But my question is, to the sponsor, you spoke about open space. I think, can you remind us again, what situations might we want that open space requirement that you spoke to? And I guess I'm kind of torn, because I think I find it hard to believe that a developer would not want to make an attractive development. And so that's where I'm starting from, but I'm open to these ideas.
Yep. So the S version elimination was a concern that the reading of the requirement would be overly prescriptive and prevent fences. So if you do a planned unit development, think of like small lots, and your open space are the yards, right? And if people put up fences, which they would be legally entitled to do, that the open space requirement wouldn't be met. And so therefore there would be some restriction on the ability to have fences on those properties. So as I said, I'm looking at possibly drafting an amendment that just basically says fences aren't an impediment to open space requirements, if they would be something someone be legally entitled to erect and compliant with code otherwise. That said, too, when we have open space requirements, I think it is important to have open space. There is the requirement that you don't have to if you're within a certain amount of distance to a public amenity like a park. But it also means housing units aren't built where you are requiring to hold open space. And those that requirement could be the difference in some of these, especially if we're talking about affordable housing, between a project penciling or not.
And I just have a quick question too. So you mentioned open space, there's that requirement, and then there's also minimum or maximum lot coverage, which is its own thing that says generally you can't build on 100% of the lot. I just wonder if that was, I don't see it covered in here, but it seems like that would still apply, or is that maybe the type of thing that could also be given a variance?
So I wish Matt was here. I don't know, but we can get back to you. How's that sound?
If I may.
Go ahead, Graham.
On page 5, at the bottom under 3, you mentioned the developer of a PUD may propose changes to density.
So I have a question for you. There are a number of bullet points that the planning department put here. You say this was just finished. Are you prepared to speak to each of these items? So since we have just a little bit of time, I think it's worth kind of a quick review of the various bullets. Why don't we just go through them?
I'd like the planning department here to do that.
I
They're
really
the
would
experts.
too, but we have this meeting now. We don't have to, but I think.
You can, but I don't know. I have a problem with having the administration answering for the, I don't know who wrote this. Did the planning director write this? Did a staff member write this? I
It says
mean,
it's from Craig, but,
but he's
who
not a
knows?
planner.
Yeah, who knows who wrote it? Yeah. Well, we'll go with Ms. Braga first, and then if we have time, there's some of these items are very interesting. Go ahead.
Thanks. So would the development that Mr. McKenna Foster was mentioning with the J.C. Penney garage, would that be a PUD type project?
I don't think so.
Okay. So nobody knows. Okay, and then the other question is, so I completely agree with you, members Alatel, that if you introduce this, it's been out there for that long, your ordinance, that it's pretty appalling to just get the response right now. Did you try to set up a meeting with them at all, or you feel like that should have been them going
I've
to you?
followed the direction of the administration, which was to work with Mr. Downing.
So, if there's no real objections, I think it would be a good use of the last 15 minutes to walk through the memo. It would be great if we could get Craig on the phone or someone on the phone from the department who could defend this letter. But, if we don't have them, then
Yeah, I think I can speak to it with some confidence, and we can follow up with planning if members have further questions. That's acceptable.
you're just putting yourself in the line.
I am.
So, okay, why don't you go ahead and start?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the question earlier, I think at the beginning, what we're outlining here is, or planning is outlined here, is that you can pass this. It's not going to end the world. We can fix it later. It's an optional process. So we're not, I think with maybe some other changes to Title 21, you might accidentally create unintended consequences that impacted every development across the city. That's not going to happen here because the PUD process is a voluntary sort of optional way to get an exception from the rules. So we're not going to accidentally kill development with these changes. That said, I think in general, our preference would be to move through the Planning and Zoning Commission process and to make that process better over time as we do that for ordinances like this. Obviously, understanding that 4-month delay has consequences in terms of how much housing we can build next year, potentially using this tool. In the first section, the planning department recommends keeping the criteria that are waived because they are optional. But the planning department believes they're useful for sort of promoting creative use and making sure that utilities can be properly cited on the site and that there's sort of natural space. I think there's a policy tension here to Member Brawley's earlier point about sort of, do we want to be micromanaging development to this degree? But they are optional criteria here. Although I think Member Zolotel's point in her presentation is that they're largely duplicative with the existing conditional use criteria. So again, a low risk thing if you do decide to waive them. The next piece, and I think this is where I disagree with this memo as a policy matter. I agree with sort of the, I think the insinuations of Member Brawley, which is that these are duplicative processes. The variance process does cost money. It does create additional delays. I think if with more time and a fuller staff report, we might be able to get a more detailed sort of compare and contrast between the conditional use process for a PUD versus the variance process to see if there are any procedural differences. But I think based on my conversations with planning, those differences are not significant enough to create major problems here. We talked about the 2-acre to 1-acre piece already. This is a positive directional change, could create additional flexibility. Members Zolotel showed us a great map of all the additional lots it would open up for development. The open space requirement, I think we've talked about. Again, this is, to Member Brawley's question, sort of a how much do we trust developers question, right? Do we trust the market to meet the demand for open space? I think, is there a market failure in terms of developments not delivering nice amenities and open space and those sorts of things that we need to make sure that they produce? My sense is maybe that was true once, but might not be true anymore, that we would trust the market to ensure that these new developments are going to be attractive and have space for people to walk their dog and those sorts of things. The next section, the planning department recommends removing these requirements because they are duplicative. The next section, the planning department was not sure about the purpose of those lines, but I think we've now heard from Member Zalatel about the purpose of those portions of the ordinance.
Can you name the sections there, page 4, line 40, that kind of thing?
Oh, yes, I could. So sorry, right now I was just talking about page 5, lines 46 to page 6, line 8. Next section would be page 6, line 16 to page 7, line 13. So again, increasing density in PUDs, that's sort of the purpose of PUDs, right? Is to allow an increased density with a clear plan. So increasing those numbers seems aligned with the goals of the PUD ordinance. Planning sort of question was how the numbers got chosen in that section. And with a fuller staff report, they'd sort of look into the rationale for those numbers, potentially offer either greater or lesser numbers depending on their sort of professional planning expertise. Under page 6, line 18 to page 7, line 13, I think perhaps this is a misreading, and members Zalatel maybe could clarify. I think there are height limits. This section would remove an exception that would allow PUDs to go over the height limits. That's a little confusing. It's sort of a double negative there. And I think that's happening because another section of the ordinance sort of consolidates those requirements and allows PUDs to exceed the height requirements. So I think that actually may be a confusion by the planning department, but I could be wrong.
Yes, if you go back to page 5 at the bottom, number 3, it basically says propose your density, lot size, use, dimensional standards, and design standards as part of your PUD and bring them forward to the Planning and Zoning Commission for discussion. So they can be looked at holistically instead of segmented out on their own.
Great. And the last section of that supports the change that would prohibit the use of mobile homes. We want to allow mobile homes or cheap housing. We want to allow them in more places. And then section 2 addresses the waiver of Planning and Zoning Commission for this ordinance. Again, generally, we prefer to go through the Planning and Zoning Commission process. We agree that it needs to be improved.
So is there a difference between mobile homes and manufactured homes? It's about the same thing.
Our code doesn't deal with the term manufactured home. It still uses mobile home, but now we've all moved on to the term manufactured home.
So we might at some point just do a blanket update of that term because I think mobile home is so stigmatized. And if we kind of shift our conversation, we might actually be able to move some balls forward.
Yeah, I think that's probably wise. And then you'll see when we talk about the pro grant, eventually kind of some of the work being done, if we're awarded, to find our local solution to manufactured housing.
That's a new project for someone who's willing. Ms. Briley.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question actually that wasn't covered in the memo, but I wonder if there's a comment on it from the sponsor or the administration. Sorry, I'm trying to find it. It has to do with special limitations and members also, I know you touched on this already. And I'm looking at page 3, starting under number 2, minimum standards. The Planning and Zoning Commission may exempt a PUD from special limitations. So I wonder if you could just speak to that, because I believe what it's saying is you have to comply with it. So it's doing the inverse. And I'll say that knowing that there's a lot of issues with special limitations. They are, I've said this before, they're not a standard planning practice. They are not something that exists in most zoning codes. And everything that they do can be done in other ways. So anyway, just preface. Thank you.
So the intent there is to remove an SL if one exists in the underlying zoning district. Because what my concern is, and we saw this play out in the Carroll Creek PUD, is it halved the density and kind of defeated the purpose of the PUD. So the idea is to remove the SL because you have a full regulatory tool also in front of you, which is the conditional use process. So if your SL involved siting of driveways or landscaping or something else, all of those things could be dealt with in the PUD through the conditional use process.
Other questions, other input, other comments? Ms. Gardner, or not Ms. Gardner, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Through the chair to members Zalatel, I had a question on the special limitation removal and kind of your intent. I did a quick, I understand the intent. As I read it right now, the Planning and Zoning Commission would be allowed to remove the SL for the PUD area. And I guess reviewing code, I noticed that typically removing special, well, our code talks a lot more about adding special limitations. That's typically done by the assembly. So I guess I was curious your thoughts on should the PZC have the power to remove it? That sounds efficient, but I guess I wanted to know, yeah, assembly versus PZC power and your goals.
I thought since the Planning and Zoning Commission was reviewing the PUD holistically, that it would make sense for them to remove the special limitation because they're using they're basically choosing a different regulatory tool. And so the question will be, once they see the whole planned unit development, does the special limitation even make sense in the context? And if so, if there are parts of it, or if it does, can those conditions be put forward through the conditional use process?
So that was Ms. Bolgiano from the Department of Law. Sorry about calling her Ms. Gardner. She had a nameplate. Mr. Myers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since Carroll Creek keeps coming up, I feel like I should make a disclosure that I am a real estate broker, been actively working on that since 2018. So I wanted to make sure the body was aware of that.
Thank you for making that disclosure, and there is no action before us. So, and on this matter, this is a general item. It's not specific to a development. And so it would be wise, I think, if you're here on Tuesday to make the disclosure during the item, the determination will be there's no apparent conflict or personal or financial interest, again, because this is a general principle, not a specific project. So does anyone object to that ruling? No, okay, thank you all. Go ahead, Ms. Elton.
One more thing I wanted to add there is because there's public process with a conditional use, I think it satisfies my concerns about planning and zoning, looking at it and making kind of a set of decisions in the full context versus only keeping that through to remove an SL right now, you'd have to go through a full rezone, which feels like a cumbersome additional process when it can be dealt with at planning and zoning.
Anyone else? Any last words? Anything from the administration? Okay, thank you. Lots of work on Title 21. And could I get this put onto my project list, the manufactured housing relabeling from mobile homes? Rather than waiting for someone to do it, I might as well just start it. Thank you. Go ahead, Karen.
I was really uncomfortable at University Community Council. The president there wanted us to explain this ordinance, and neither Felix or I were able to, give much information. I wondered if it would be possible to do a down and dirty, something that's on the assembly page for community councils to access so they know what this is about. You've explained things very well here, and I wish I would have had that information for Thursday night.
So the slideshow will be available on the work session page, so you can send them the link.
So they can get the link to the work session on the watch now? Yeah, so, and then,
That's good.
yeah, Ms.
Yeah.
Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. I forgot to ask this earlier. I wonder if the administration/planning department could follow up with some information about the rough number of PUDs that have been used or put into place, or maybe just some examples, because I think there's some neighborhoods like the Baxter Bog area. I know that's been a big PUD. Just to give a scale of how often this is used and maybe some concrete examples, knowing that those are all folks who went through this process already, obviously. And then maybe if there are any pending right now, because I think it's helpful to know the scale of, is everyone using this? Is no one using this? What does that look like? Thank you.
Okay, others, anyone else? Okay, then we're gonna go ahead and adjourn this work session. We'll convene back in 15 minutes for a special meeting. There's like 30 items.